Sorry, there has been an error. Goodbye.
As promised, we want to take a look now at Protestant fundamentalism as an aspect of anti-modernism, particularly as an aspect of the quest for certainty in the anti-modernist area. Protestant fundamentalism began as a movement among evangelical Protestant denominations in the 1870s. And in the 1870s, we see the blossoming of a number of what we would even today call evangelical denominations. For example, the holiness tradition, which sprang from Methodism, began in the 1870s. The old Millerites developed into the Seventh-day Adventists a little earlier than the 1870s, but they became reasonably strong in the 1870s. And we see the development of other obviously Protestant denominations in the 1870s into the 1900s. But Protestant fundamentalism did not come to be I hesitate to say as we understand it today, because we confuse that word fundamentalism with evangelical, and we use it as a political term in our modern political parlance. So let's back it up just a little bit. Fundamentalism was a particular brand, or not really a brand, but an area of Protestant belief that began in the 1870s and became articulated in the 19-teens. In 1912, it comes specifically from a set of 12 pamphlets that were financed by Lyman Stewart, pictured here, who was the president of Union Oil Company of California, which he paid for the publication of these 12 pamphlets. And together, these pamphlets go under the overall title of The Fundamentals. They codified the basic belief of what came to be known as fundamentalism. And the word fundamentalist was coined by and promoted by a Northern Baptist Conference Reverend Pastor Curtis Lee Laws at the 1920 Northern Baptist Conference in Boogaloo, New York. So what are some of the beliefs, some of the tenets of Protestant fundamentalism as articulated in these 12 pamphlets, the fundamentals? Really three three ideas found the fundamentals. The first and probably most critical is the literal interpretation of the Bible, biblical literalism, that the Bible is the inerrant literal word of God. This was in direct opposition to the higher criticism of modernism that sprang from David Strauss and Ludwig Feuerbach. Another tenet of Protestant fundamentalism is the belief in the Genesis version of creation. Now, if you know much about the Bible, you know that there are 2 or 3 creation stories spread throughout the Old Testament. But the Protestant fundamentalists, as laid out in these pamphlets, chose the Genesis version of creation. That's the 6 days and the world is here version of creation. And there had to be, one of the tenets was an absolute belief in both the virgin birth and the resurrection of Jesus, the physical resurrection of the body of Jesus as the Christ. These are the 3 great tenets of Protestant fundamentalism as laid out in these pamphlets. Another aspect of fundamentalism is that it was part and parcel of revivalism, at least revivalism and There are waves of revivalism in American history, the so-called Great Awakening of the 1720s to 1740s, another Great Awakening in the 1820s to 1840s. There's some scholars that argue that there was a Great Awakening in 1857, at least a wave of revivalism, that's true, in 1857. There was another wave of revivalism during the Civil War in both North and South. Then there was this development of these new denominations from 1870 till about 1910, the articulation of fundamentalism. And then there was, after about 1912 into the 1930s, another wave of revivalism. And we see a lot of this in the 1920s, often associated with powerful preachers who tapped into public relations and public entertainment modes to help themselves. One of these is Foursquare's Amy Semple McPherson, who you see off on the left here, and another is Billy Sunday, who you see to the right. Both of these preachers, obviously very sincere, at the same time quite human, they're fascinating. They're fascinating studies. Starting with Billy Sunday, who's a little bit older than Amy Semple McPherson and whose career started a little bit earlier, became a millionaire through his revival preaching. He had started out as a baseball player, became a baseball star, left baseball to preach revivals, and became so powerful that when he came to a city, he could demand that the city erect a 5,000-seat auditorium for him. Often these were made of wood in a big square, because he only preached for a week or two at a place. He would take offerings from the people, and what he was selling was religion. He kind of commercialized religion. Amy Semple McPherson commercialized religion in Los Angeles. She really understood this new mass marketing technique of advertising, and she understood that she could play on emotion, and a sensitive emotion. She was also a faith healer, and Foursquare is now a recognized denomination, at least on the West Coast. I'm not sure how far it's spread, but up and down the West Coast, it's a reasonably powerful Protestant denomination. Foursquare began, Amy Semple McPherson was looking for a mechanism to promote her religious beliefs and to engage in revivalism. She built the Angelus Temple, the first permanent 5,000-seat auditorium in the United States. So giantism was part of her appeal. She was also, again, extremely emotional. She did some things that seemed kind of silly. For example, she created the Salvation Navy because the Salvation Army was already there, having been created in England and imported into the United States after 1870. McPherson had the eye of the nation, and at one point she disappeared for 14 days, and she reemerged from the Mexican desert, a little bit worse for wear, but telling the story of having been kidnapped. People thought that she had wandered off into the ocean and had drowned, but she told the story of being kidnapped and being held for ransom, but being able to escape. And this story just didn't really hold water. It became kind of obvious. This is a little slanderous, but it's pretty well accepted that she was having a love affair with her bookkeeper, and that they had run off, didn't take any of the money, but that they had run off to Mexico for just a couple of week vacation and a tryst. But even though that had come out very early in her, almost immediately after she came back, it didn't damage her career at all. Eventually she faded from view, however, just like Billy Sunday did, hot on the heels, you might say, of the apogee that became the nadir of the Protestant fundamentalist movement. The thing that kind of killed it off was the so-called Scopes monkey trial in Dayton, Tennessee in 1925. Fundamentalists were able to pass a law that prohibited the teaching of Darwinian evolution in Tennessee. This is called the Butler Law. Immediately after it was passed, a science teacher in Dayton, Tennessee, wanted to challenge the law. The American Civil Liberties Union, which existed then, wanted to challenge the law. And a group of local boosters wanted to bring tourists into Dayton, Tennessee. So all working together, really Scopes and the local boosters, and then bringing in the ACLU later, taught a class about evolution. That is, he taught one section of one class one day about evolution. He brought it up in his science class. He told the constabulary that he was going to do this, and they, after school, went and arrested him. Now, there's even some consternation about whether Scopes actually taught this class or not. He was, in one story, absent from school that day when the class was taught, and a substitute ended up teaching it. Nevertheless, he was arrested for this, and this wasn't any longer about, the trial was not about whether he had taught evolution or not. He pled not guilty, but it was well known that he was taking responsibility for this. This became a battle between the two guys that you see in the image on the right, Clarence Darrow and William Jennings Bryan. The ACLU hired Clarence Darrow to defend John Scopes and to argue that the law itself was wrong and therefore should not be enforced. Not that Scopes did or didn't do it, was innocent or not, but that the law was faulty. William Jennings Bryan, in his last act, this trial led to his death. He joined the prosecution. The prosecution lost focus. And so the trial turned into what the boosters had wanted, which was a big show trial, bringing in a lot of passionate people from the countryside and from other places, spending all of their money in Dayton and putting Dayton on the map. The prosecution lost focus. Clarence Darrow was prevented from bringing in his expert witnesses to try to prove the validity of evolution, which was not at issue. The prosecution, however, allowed Darrow, and the judge allowed Darrow to question Bryan as an authority on the Bible. Once Bryan began testifying about the inerrancy of the Bible, then Clarence Darrow, and by the way, Clarence Darrow and William Jennings Bryan were friends and political and personal colleagues for years and years and years, but they differed on this one thing. This was billed as a battle between proper religion as extolled by William Jennings Bryan, the so-called great commoner, who you might remember from his Cross of Gold speech and from resigning as Secretary of State under Wilson because of Wilson's, what he thought of as Wilson's bellicose response to the Lusitania sinking. And Clarence Darrow, the agnostic's agnostic, the atheist's atheist, who's going to champion a stereotyped version of science. At least that's how this was billed. Bryan was skewered on the stand by Darrow, who tied Bryan up in knots. Not that Bryan was stupid, not that he did anything foolish, except allow himself to be questioned on inconsistencies in the Bible by Clarence Darrow. Eventually, the trial, which took place in the summer months, which in Dayton, Tennessee, extended apparently into October, but in the blistering summer of 1925, this trial took place. Eventually, John Scopes was found guilty, and the $100 fine he was required to pay was never paid by him. He went on, I'm not sure what happened to him. Clarence Darrow won the case, but the case killed William Jennings Bryan, who just after the case was over, had gone to speak on it, suffered a heart attack, and died before 1926. Anyway, we have looked at one significant element of anti-modernism, and that is religious fundamentalism, as it manifested itself between 1912 and 1930. And I thank you, as always, for your attention.